So it's October, which means it's the right time to talk about my summer reading. The first book that I read and finished and loved is this one. I don't know how people hold this. I'm just going to hold it. It is Horse Crazy by Gary Indiana. What a novel. What a novel. So Horse Crazy is about a critic, this man who is a critic, and he lives in downtown New York. It's the 80s. It's like drug-addled New York. The fringes of society where like it's a lot of gay people, lesbians, they're all artsy fartsy, you know, that basically that vibe. And so he's of that world and he meets another man named Gregory, and thus begins this turbulent relationship. I wouldn't describe this as a like love story. I think this is a story about infatuation. I think it's about how consumptive love can become. And I thought this was interesting because the backdrop of this story is during like the AIDS epidemic. It's like a lot of people that this critic knows are like dying or contracting this awful disease, and it's through intimacy, it's through, you know, being with somebody else. And I thought that was something interesting that we were kind of like being shown of this correlation between love and illness. So this main guy, like, he falls in lust and in infatuation with this Gregory guy who is this charismatic, manipulative, charming, younger guy. And this, honestly, this novel, I kept thinking of the movie The Souvenir, directed by Joanna Hogg. It's about this young female filmmaker, and she comes from a wealthy family, but she's young, she's trying to figure herself out, and she kind of falls as well for this this man who he's older, he's charismatic, but he's also a drug addict. And so it kind of follows that tumultuous relationship and how defining it was for her. Yeah, I don't know, there's just something very like interesting about stories like this, this book and the movie that I'm describing, because it kind of gets into how inexplicable desire is. And like, desire is one of my like tried and true subjects. I love reading about desire, I love thinking about desire, I love wondering about what it is that draws us to someone. All sense is gone, all logic, all, you're not like thinking clearly. You know deep down that this person is wrong for you, or this person is using you in certain ways, but like it's very hard for you to remove yourself from the situation. I want to read an early part in this novel that like, I think it basically sums up the entire relationship, and it also just gets at this quality of desire that's very hard to pin down. So this is right after the critic, our narrator, he's met this Gregory guy for the first time. So they've hung out once, and he goes home and he's like, well, I'm in love, I'm obsessed with this person. And so he's trying to write Gregory a letter that basically communicates these feelings. And so he drafts a few, and this is from one of the drafts. He's like he writes like 20 pages of a love letter that he's just trying to write to this person that he's just met. So it's very, it very much has that vibe. So it goes, I desire you. It's as simple and awful as that. And if this doesn't repulse you, despite your current arrangements, I will propose something disgustingly modern, vulgar, contrary to my own way of doing things, but I want you. If you ever feel you want me, should you ever have a moment's urge to make love, I don't care when, you can phone me up in the middle of the night and come over. You use my body for whatever you like, and if it suits you, you can then leave and never have any contact with me again. I don't know how else to present this. I'm not a subtle person in matters of this kind. I'm open to any urge you might have, however perverse or cruel. It's idiotic, but I love you. I'm like, I don't know if it shows up, but my listener there was like, oh my god, because I had to underline the whole thing. I was like, what the hell? Like, it's very romantic, but it's also disturbing. Something fascinating I find about the recklessness that he he writes in there, and like throughout the novel, he it's I think it's an approach to like love and relationships that I don't have. Like, I'm very guarded. I guard my heart. And so for me, viewing this, it feels like a reckless opening of oneself. Like, there's something brave about it, but there's also something idiotic, like he says, like, you kind of open yourself up to another person, and you open yourself up to the possibility of love. In the introduction, actually, like, Toby Hazlitt does get into that. There's this really great line that I think really sums up the novel and the different themes of like love, sex, illness, that it's obsession, that it really gets at. So Toby has that right. To open your life is to threaten it, to die in effect for love. I don't know, I just think it's beautiful. So I read this first and I loved it so much, and this was very hard to move on from. So that novel was a really tough act for me to follow. I think it stayed with me where I didn't just want to like jump into another novel and leave that world. So I decided instead to read a zine. So this is Leste magazine, and it's their 8th issue. It's an erotic magazine. It gets into themes I'm interested in: love, sex, desire. I feel like there's not many like... Oh, this is the back, which I also really love. I feel like Leste magazine is something that's really needed. They're actually ending the magazine now because I think it's very expensive to run, and that makes me sad. But like, I'm going to link to where you can purchase back issues and like digital version. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but there's kind of like this war on sex and pleasure, and any sort of like progressive sexual politics is really being there's these attempts to like eradicate that. As where I feel like we're turning towards a more like puritanist, righteously moral view of sex that is very damaging. I think we can see this with what has happened with regards to like abortion rights, the situation with like OnlyFans, the damaging like trans bill. I think all of these things are definitely pointing towards a more conservative leaning view of sexual politics, and I think that's something that people should be aware of, and why magazines like this are important. I don't think sex is inherently radical, but I think there's so much around it, and so much around the way that we relate with ourselves and are intimate with ourselves. It's a lot that teaches us about ourselves. It's a lot about who people are and who people can be. And I think having representations of erotics helps us to have that, to have sexual representation of queer people, of non-white people, of, you know, fetishes. I think these are important, and I think I find that it's much more important to like have a more open arena for conversations like this, instead of closing it up in a very like puritanist way. Anyway, that's my rant before I get into how good this magazine is. So I have 2 issues of this physically, and then I bought, I think, issues 1 to 5 digitally. But yeah, it's gorgeous. It's like printed on this matte print with like these monochrome colors, this very bright orange that is tripping up my camera. I picked this up, it was one Sunday afternoon, and I just wanted to like spend time reading a zine, and I had a really good time. I actually want to talk about like a few pieces of writing that I really liked in this. There's a like short fiction piece called Finishing a Drink Before the Ice Melts. This is by Emma Cohen, and then I'm going to read like this little excerpt from it that really stole my heart. While I was stealing t-shirts from Value Village, I was listening to a podcast interview with a poet that says someday she'd like to just date a busboy and be normal. My friend, who stole a silver candelabra from Value Village because of their supposedly corrupt moral operations, encouraged me to try stealing it as an exercise in grit. That's just one reason to do it. I conflate the image of the busboy and being normal with theft and silver. I conflate it with my own projections of the busboy coming home to the poet after a particularly long shift, slightly aching and smelling of smoked fish and potato grease. A busboy scrapes and cleans leftover food scraps from dishware like licking skin. The more you do it, the less pleasurable the action becomes, and eventually it loses any sense of aesthetic or sensory romance and is merely mechanical. The action itself just needs to be completed. Something like spaghetti sauce might be easier to clean off, and something like pesto might be more difficult. Years ago, my friend left period blood soaked all over the sheets of the person she loved before he broke her heart. I'm convinced he still loves her and always will, because for weeks after their uncoupling, anytime someone would visit his room and see his sheets, he'd tell them that he'd spilled spaghetti in bed. I just love writing like that. Like, it's more so the impressions that you're guessing. There's this poem by September Shiva called Come When You Come, and I really liked this part. Everything was soaked in heat, including my insides, and it felt sweet. I could feel a callousness forming in an area I used to be soft. There's this piece by Farah DM Putri called Rangda, and I like this little bit too. The answer was simple. My lips were lonely. Nothing makes it better aphrodisiac. If it wasn't a person, I learned to kiss a bottle or a cigarette as chastely as any cherry boy. Make it brief, sweet, and thoughtless as breathing virgin air. Cough him out, inhale again. There's a solitude to sealed lips I cannot bear. And then, I don't know what the censorship situation is like on YouTube, but this is called Fuck Up the Century, and it is a roundtable discussion. It focuses on the movies Young and Beautiful, the movie Tangerine, and the first season of The Girlfriend Experience. I've only seen 2 of that. Tangerine I remember liking, and then The Girlfriend Experience season 1 I really loved. Yeah, who's on the round table? It's Gabrielle Marceau, Senna Yi, and special guest Nicole Richardson. So they examine space, intimacy, and power structures in sex work depicted in those pieces of media. Really was some really interesting insights in this roundtable discussion. How the flaneur is like traditionally very male. Meanwhile, women roaming the streets were looked down upon as fallen women or sex workers, though who else would know a city and its inner workings more intimately, but who ultimately holds the power of space, the entitlement of owning a city or a street. This is Senna Yi. Here's something I thought was really interesting that Nicole brings up, how these questions of ownership in terms of space become increasingly complicated as labor forces drastically change, as labor becomes increasingly feminized or privatized to prioritize the service and leisure economies. The sexual cell becomes ubiquitous, and all working women are in some way or another expected to commodify their sexuality. But the actual sale of sex, however, takes place mostly out of sight, behind closed doors. Because of its invisibility, images of sex work are important in establishing our understanding of sex work hierarchies. While bodies that are privileged can subscribe to choice narratives, bodies that are policed and abused can be persuaded to do work that is not only underpaid and overlooked, but performed in increasingly risky and precarious conditions. And then Nicole also brings up this point with regards to, I think, Tangerine. The fact that female identity under capitalism is something that must be carefully curated and imposed upon the body is something that trans women understand better than anyone else. The pressure to spend large amounts of money to pass as female is a far more urgent version of purchase identity than that of Isabel's clumsy performance of adult sexuality. This is exemplified in the heart-wrenching scene where Cindy and Alexandra wash Cindy's wig at a laundromat, an enterprise which aids in the performance of private work in public, after she has a drink thrown on her by a car full of transphobic men. Alexandra offers a clearly distraught Cindy her wig while the solid wig is washed, a touching peace offering which is beautifully framed against the laundromat window, a see-through thin and ultimately temporary protection between them and the unforgiving and precarious streets. This is one of my favorite pieces from this. It's called Abstinence. It is by Nico Farrar, and let me just say this is one of the hottest things I've ever read. I think I can read a little bit of it. It is H's first house dinner. H and Y are talking about climate angst, code for ideology, code for commitment. She's struggling to impress, erect posture, barely blinking, faint sweat on her hairline, has used the term object-oriented ontology twice. I am mid-bite when Y unzips their fly. My knees become numb at the sound. I stop chewing, discreetly spit squash on my plate, and excuse myself. I slide down in my chair, slumping until my knees hit the floor. I bend my head into Y's lap. Tablecloth tassels drag at my temples. So that's where I'll stop. Okay, so the next thing I read was The House in Paris by Elizabeth Bowen. I really enjoyed this. When 11-year-old Henrietta arrives at the Fishers' well-appointed house in Paris, she's prepared to spend her day between trains, looked after by an old friend of her grandmother's. She longs to see a few sights in the foreign city. Little does she know what fascinating secrets the Fishers' house itself contains. For Henrietta finds that her visit coincides with that of Leopold, an intense child who has come to Paris to be introduced to the mother he has never known. In the course of a single day, the relations among Leopold, Henrietta's agitated hostess Naomi Fisher, Leopold's mysterious mother, his dead father, and the dying matriarch in bed upstairs comes to light slowly and tantalizingly. And when Henrietta leaves the house that evening, it is in possession of the kind of grave knowledge usually reserved for adults. I think it's a very psychological novel if you like analyzing people and people's actions. I enjoy things where it's it takes place over a small period of time and a lot of secrets come unfolding. That's just it's catnip to me. I enjoyed how Elizabeth Bowen handled the characters, especially the children characters. There wasn't the kind of judgment or the kind of condescending viewpoints that you might expect. You really felt enmeshed in this world. Okay, the last novel I read, I actually finished this in September, so it kind of trips over into a fall read. My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. The cold, detached nature of this narrator kind of made me keep her at arm's length too, and made me keep the novel on the whole at arm's length. There were also some things that are going on in my personal life that I think made me kind of fall into the numb state that the narrator kind of is. This follows this woman. It's the year 2000. She is, a woman with, on the surface, all of the privileges that we can list out now. And she's white, she's blonde, she's thin, she's effortlessly beautiful. She's rich. She comes from a rich family, college educated, works at an art gallery. So on the surface, she's that kind of person that you're well, that she has no problems. Something I really like that Ottessa did is she just made her very, I feel unlikable is a word that's been used for this narrator a lot, but I would also just say it's a thing you do with monsters too, where you peel all of these things that on the surface this is how they appear. You know what a monster is, but then they have the soft hearts or something. So this one kind of does the opposite, where from the outside she's beautiful, she is privileged, and then on the inside she is this cold person. This girl, or this woman rather, decides to embark on a year-long hibernation project. She will be taking pills, a lot of drugs, to fall asleep because she does not want to have to deal with the world. I thought this was really interesting. I thought it was an interesting concept for a novel. Personally, I enjoyed the 2000s depiction. I liked it. I finished it. I was happy to be done with it. I think I was just happy to be out of this world. But yeah, I don't really have much to say about this. I didn't have strong feelings towards it. Okay, bye.